Introducing our next guest for the next topic we're going to talk about. Speaking of international affairs, Alex Newman's with us now. He's CEO of Liberty Sentinel Media, and he's here to talk about the UN and the things that they're doing to try to spread their tentacles in our daily lives. Alex Newman, welcome to the core.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, Alex, we've had on guests before to talk about the threat that the WHO has, the World Health Organization has on our daily lives. And the UN is really no different. They're equally a threat to our national sovereignty. So give us a little background here.
Well, thanks again for having me on, Walker. And I just got back from the UN Summit of the Future. This was a hugely significant meeting. They prepared for a long time in advance. They actually marketed it as we're transforming the UN from UN to UN 2.0. Those are their terms, not mine. As the Secretary General put it over and over again, we can't build a future for our grandchildren using institutions built by our grandparents. So they're talking about dramatic transformations here for the UN, the World Health Organization, of course, being one arm of the UN, one specialized agency of the UN. And when you read the outcome document from this meeting, the so-called Pact for the Future, which was passed by consensus, in other words, every government in the world at the very least allowed it to get through, they are calling for essentially what they did during COVID, what the WHO did to the world during COVID over the last 4 years or so. Extend that out to every area of life, education, the environment, the economy, you name it. And they've even got a special provision in there, action item number 54 in this international agreement, that calls for making the United Nations, and in particular the Secretary General, the central coordinating mechanism for dealing with global emergencies. So we're talking about a massive transfer of power, Walker, from sovereign nation states to the United Nations and its agencies.
Alex, this is these agencies are these institutions rather, like the United Nations. They tend to be hijacked by the Marxist and by the communist around the world, and really, in many cases, don't work in the best interest of America. How much? Talk about the kind of the jurisdiction here, because obviously the UN in and of itself doesn't really have any jurisdiction anywhere, practically speaking. But the fact that the U.S. buys into this, both financially and otherwise, really creates problems. So just talk about that whole structure of how an international agency like this or institution can actually have, real life implications domestically.
Yeah, thank you, Walker. And this is such an important topic for people to wrap their heads around because it is going to affect every area of your life going forward. So when you go back 80 years when they were creating the UN in San Francisco, we were told this is just about peace. We just want to try to prevent another world war. So we're not even talking about sovereignty. We're not talking about giving the UN jurisdiction over anything. This is just for nations to come together, really governments, and work out plans for peace without resorting to war. Well, if you go back to that first meeting where they created the UN, where they wrote the UN Charter in San Francisco, the handwriting was already on the wall, Walker. Let's start with one of the main individuals involved in the creation of this, supposedly an American. His name was Alger Hiss, very little known today, although extremely prominent at the time. He was the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter. Then they made him the first Secretary General of the United Nations. And again, he's supposed to be an American. Right? That should have been a big red flag. Why is Stalin okay with an American leading all these meetings? Well, we found out later. We ended up prosecuting him. We threw him in federal prison because he was a spy for Joseph Stalin, one of the worst mass murdering butchers to ever walk on this planet. So that's a pretty big red flag right there. Another one of the key Americans who was involved was John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State at the time. And he wrote an incredible book in 1950 called War or Peace. And in this book, he actually reveals the game plan. He says the UN today is just the primitive stage. But ultimately, he says, even under the current UN Charter, we can make this into a world federation, or world government is the term he used in his book, and that is where we're going with this. And he said it in very clear English right in his book published in 1950. So right from the very beginning, Marxist tentacles and fingerprints were all over this thing, and right from the very beginning, they had this ambition of drastically expanding the UN to eventually encompass not just peace, but the environment, the economy, sustainable development, your health care, all of it. And so we're moving very rapidly now toward this UN 2.0 that will actually play a major role, not just in our healthcare like we saw during COVID, not just in our education like we're seeing through UNESCO, but in every area of life.
Alex, once again, we're talking to Alex Newman about the threat of the United Nations on American sovereignty in our daily lives. When you look at just the concept of the UN, it's a very much unbiblical and unconstitutional concept. And here's why. Let me explain that. The Bible talks about nations and borders. It doesn't talk about one world government, except in Revelation, which is not a very good thing. So, and then our founding fathers made it abundantly clear that the broader the power, the more likelihood for corruption. This is why we have checks and balances. This is why you have a 10th Amendment, so states have a certain degree of sovereignty. And so if we're having trouble in America in 2024, like preserving the basic fundamentals of freedom and liberty and virtue, what makes us think and our nation's leaders think that we can have a United Nations that is doing anything good?
That is such a good point, Walker. And I tell people this all the time. I mean, you think the federal government's bad now, you can vote them out of office, right? Wait until these powers are exercised by I call it the United Abominations. And you're absolutely right about the Bible, right? I encourage people, go read Deuteronomy chapter 32. Go read Acts chapter 17. God is crystal clear that it was his idea, it was his design to divide mankind up into nations. You can read that whole story in Genesis chapter 11. They tried to build their goofy tower, and God came down and confused their languages. And that is right there, the Genesis of nations. That was God's design for humanity. He did it on purpose, with a purpose. Now they want to rebuild this one world system where we're all going to come together and we're going to defy God. And you're right about the Constitution, too. I really want people to think about this. Our Constitution was based on the same principles that we find in the Declaration of Independence, which were based on the principles that we read in the Bible. God said, "Thou shalt not murder, therefore you have a right to life." God said, "Government must punish evil. Murder is evil. Therefore, the government has an obligation to help you protect your right to life." Same is true with property. God said, "Don't steal. You have a right to property. Theft is evil. Therefore, government has to help you protect your God-given right to life and property and liberty and all the rest." Now, you look at the UN model, it's exactly the opposite. You have no rights. You're granted some privileges in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 29 says none of these rights and privileges can ever be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN. So it's completely backwards. And these aren't just different visions. These are visions that are fundamentally incompatible. They cannot both exist at the same time. So to the extent that the UN extends its power, extends its jurisdiction, and by the way, there was never any constitutional authority for Congress to surrender these authorities to the UN. In fact, many of these authorities they never even had. Right? The U.S. Constitution doesn't give the federal government any jurisdiction over health care or education, and yet now the federal government wants to delegate those powers to the UN. It's totally crazy. It's totally unbiblical. It's totally unconstitutional, and people are starting to get it. I think that's why, for the most part, Americans haven't even heard about this Summit of the Future or the Pact for the Future. The
Yeah.
media knows, the politicians know that Americans will not go for this if they're given the facts.
Yeah, that's right. And we have to have national leaders in Congress and the White House that completely resist this whole idea of one world government, global order, UN, WHO. It's really gotten to a point, Alex, and I know you probably know this better than me, but it's gotten to a point where these institutions aren't really any good anymore. I mean, they've totally veered off track. They're not even doing what they were set up for, and they're doing more harm than good on the world stage. We can have alliances, we can have partnerships around the world, and we should for the advancement of good and peace and prosperity. But setting up some kind of one world government with any type of binding authority is a terrible, terrible idea. We can't even get our own house in order. We're sitting at 35 trillion in debt, divorce rate at 50%. Families falling apart, economy falling apart, abortion on demand, and we think we're going to somehow have a UN one world government with prosperity. I mean, who are we kidding here? Alex, tell our folks where they can read more about your work.
Well, thank you again for having me on the program. My personal website is libertysentinel.org, and also senior editor at the New American. I was covering the UN Summit of the Future for the New American magazine. They can find us at thenewamerican.com, and newsletter absolutely free at libertysentinel.org. And thank you again for having me on the program, Walker.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex. Appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much. Appreciate the work. That's Alex Newman, CEO of Liberty Sentinel, and he was talking about his experience at the UN summit and their master plans for global one world government. And folks, this is not, the left. I'm convinced. I'll have to do my study on this, but I'm convinced the left, if they didn't create the term conspiracy theory, they definitely hijacked it at some point and turned it into a dirty word, into a bad word. But this is not conspiracy stuff. This is reality. I mean, these folks, whether it be the UN or the WHO, they talk about this stuff openly and publicly. We just don't listen to it. We just don't pay attention to it. I mean, if you watch World Health Organization meetings, if you watch United Nation meetings, they talk about the goal of a one world government. That's what they talk about. And then when you're talking about revelation type stuff, these meetings, they talk about a digital ID that's somewhere on your skin or implanted in your body. I mean, these are concepts that are like, there's no way people are talking about this, but they actually talk about it. They strategize about it. They produce reports about it, and they do it all from these global agencies. So this is not conspiracy stuff. This is reality, and there are people that want to do evil things, and they're talking about it publicly.